Some people don't go quiet because they have nothing to say. They go quiet because saying things once cost them too much. You've seen this kind of silence before. The kind that shows up after disappointment, after being misunderstood, after explaining yourself one too many times and realizing nothing actually changed. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like distance, like indifference, but underneath it, something very different is happening. This silence isn't empty, it's protective. In psychology, this pattern is often described as emotionally withdraw, a survival response, where a person pulls inward to protect themselves from emotional harm. At some point in their life, being open didn't lead to connection. It led to confusion, conflict, or dismissal. Words were twisted, feelings were minimized. Vulnerability became something that worked against them instead of for them. And slowly, quietly, their system learned a rule. Staying quiet hurts less than being misunderstood. So silence became a strategy, not a conscious one, not a dramatic one, a practical one, a way to avoid emotional collisions, a way to stay regulated when the environment felt unsafe, a way to keep dignity when being honest seemed to invite harm. This is where most people get it wrong. They assume silence means absence of emotion, of care, of depth. In reality, silence often means memory, the body remembering what happened the last time words were offered and not held with care. Because silence isn't weakness, and it isn't coldness. It's a form of intelligence learned under pressure, a nervous system choosing containment over exposure, protection over explanation. In this video, we're going to explore the hidden psychology of people who choose to emotionally withdraw, not to disappear, but to survive. And the question isn't why do some people go quiet? The real question is, what did they learn would happen if they didn't? Because once you understand that, silence stops looking like distance and starts looking like survival. Silence was never the first choice. No one is born believing their feelings are a burden or that their voice doesn't matter. That belief is learned slowly, quietly, in moments that often look small from the outside. It begins when expressing yourself doesn't lead to understanding. When you explain how something hurt and you're told you're overreacting. When you share confusion and it's brushed aside. When you speak with honesty and the response isn't curiosity, it's defensiveness, dismissal, or silence. In return, over time, a pattern forms. Each attempt to speak carries a cost. Emotional exposure without safety, vulnerability without repair, and eventually, the mind makes an adjustment, not out of weakness, but out of self-preservation. If saying something creates tension, misunderstanding, or rejection, then maybe saying nothing is safer. This is how silence becomes learned behavior, not as avoidance, but as adaptation. It often happens early in families, where emotions were inconvenient, in relationships where needs were inconvenient, in environments where being easy was rewarded more than being honest. The lesson isn't taught in words, it's taught in outcomes. And once that lesson settles into the body, silence stops feeling like suppression. It feels like control, like stability, like the least painful option available. What looks like withdrawal later in life is often just the echo of a moment long ago, when being open didn't bring closeness, and quiet became the only way to stay intact. In psychology, this pattern has a name, but despite how clinical that sounds, it isn't about detachment or lack of feeling. Emotional withdrawal is what happens when connection has become unpredictable, when closeness feels conditional, and expression feels risky. It's the mind and body stepping back, not because they don't want connection, but because they no longer trust it to be safe. There are important distinctions here. Some people withdraw temporarily. They go quiet to regulate, to think, to calm themselves before re-engaging. That kind of withdrawal is healthy. It's intentional, flexible, and reversible. But emotional withdrawal becomes something else when it turns chronic. Instead of being a pause, it becomes a position. The person doesn't just step back from a conversation, they step back from expectation, from hope, from the possibility that being understood is even available. Over time, withdrawal stops being something they do and becomes something they are. This is where silence is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like emotional distance or lack of interest. But internally, the emotional system is often highly active. Thoughts are racing, feelings are intense, scenarios are replayed and analyzed. The person is deeply engaged, just not outwardly expressive. Because expression, at some point, became associated with cost. Emotional withdrawal isn't the absence of emotion. It's emotion held too carefully. And that careful holding usually comes from experience. From learning that being open didn't lead to repair, only exposure. That explaining yourself didn't bring clarity, only more confusion. That showing how much you care made you vulnerable in ways no one protected. So the system adapts. It limits access. It narrows expression. It keeps everything internal, where at least it can be managed. This is why telling someone to just open up rarely works. Withdrawal isn't stubbornness. It's a protective structure built around a sensitive emotional core. One that learned, very early on, that closeness without safety can hurt more than distance ever could. For many people who go quiet, silence isn't a choice made by the mind. It's a response initiated by the nervous system. When psychologists talk about survival responses, most people are familiar with fight or flight. But there's a third response that's far less discussed and far more misunderstood. Freeze. Freeze happens when the system detects threat, but doesn't see a safe way to escape or defend. The body stays still. Energy drops inward. Speech becomes difficult, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it feels unsafe at a physiological level. This is why so many people describe the same experience. They know exactly what they're feeling. They can articulate it clearly in their head. But the moment they try to speak, something locks up. The throat tightens. Words vanish. It feels like being blocked from the inside. That isn't emotional immaturity. It isn't avoidance. It's a nervous system prioritizing survival over expression. In freeze, the body chooses containment. Staying quiet reduces the risk of escalation, reduces exposure, reduces the chance of emotional harm repeating itself. The system isn't trying to connect, it's trying to stay safe. And here's the part most people miss. Freeze is often learned in relational environments, not life-threatening ones. Chronic misunderstanding, emotional unpredictability, or repeated dismissal can train the nervous system to treat communication itself as a threat. So when silence appears, it isn't disinterest, it's regulation. A body remembering what happened the last time honesty was offered without protection, and deciding, in that moment, that quiet is the safest place to land. What most people never realize is how busy the inside of a quiet person really is. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It usually means everything is happening just internally. These are people with constant inner dialogue. They replay conversations long after they end. They analyze tone, timing, and meaning. They ask themselves what they could have said differently, whether they were fair, whether they were too much, or not enough. Their emotional world is active, layered, and often exhausting. They don't avoid feelings, they process them alone. Inside, there are explanations being rehearsed, emotions being named, connections being made. They understand their own experience with surprising clarity. But clarity inside doesn't always translate to expression outside, because speaking requires something more than understanding. It requires safety. When the inner world becomes the only place where feelings are allowed to exist, it grows louder over time. Thoughts pile up, emotions loop. There's no external release, no shared regulation. Everything has to be carried, sorted, and contained by one person alone. This is why quiet people are often misunderstood as distant or disengaged. From the outside, they seem calm, composed, hard to read, but internally, they may be holding entire conversations that never make it into the room, and that disconnect takes a toll. Living with a loud inner world and a silent outer one creates tension. Not because the person lacks emotional intelligence, but because their emotional intelligence has nowhere safe to go. Silence, in this context, isn't emptiness. It's compression, a life lived inwardly. Not by preference, but by necessity. For someone who has learned to go quiet, silence isn't neutral, it feels safer. Not because silence is comfortable, but because misunderstanding is painful in a very specific way. Being misunderstood doesn't just distort your words, it distorts who you are. Your intentions get rewritten, your emotions get reframed, and suddenly, you're not only hurt, you're misrepresented. Over time, that kind of experience creates a quiet calculation. If I speak, I risk being twisted. If I stay silent, at least I won't be misread. Silence becomes a form of control, a way to limit damage, a way to keep your inner reality from being handled carelessly by people who don't know how to hold it. When expression repeatedly leads to correction, defensiveness, or dismissal, the system adapts by reducing exposure. This is the paradox most people miss. Silence protects you from conflict, but it also protects you from connection. By staying quiet, you avoid arguments, emotional escalation, and the exhaustion of explaining yourself. But you also forfeit the chance to be fully known. You trade the risk of being misunderstood for the certainty of being unseen. And at first, that trade feels worth it, because the pain of invisibility is quieter than the pain of misrepresentation. It doesn't erupt. It doesn't escalate. It settles into the background and becomes familiar. But safety built on silence is fragile. It keeps you regulated, but isolated. What began as self-protection slowly becomes self-limitation. Not because you chose distance over closeness, but because closeness once came without care. Silence felt safer than being misunderstood, until one day, it starts to feel like the only option left. One of the most confusing things about people who withdraw emotionally is how inconsistent they can seem. One day, they're warm, engaged, funny, fully present. The next, they're distant, quiet, hard to reach. To others, this shift looks contradictory, even manipulative. But internally, there's nothing random about it. This isn't moodiness, it's capacity. When someone has learned to regulate themselves through silence, social engagement becomes an energy-intensive task. Being expressive requires safety, emotional bandwidth, and a nervous system that feels resourced enough to stay open. On good days, they have that capacity. They can show up, connect, and even shine. But that openness comes at a cost. After extended interaction, emotional exposure, or subtle tension, their system often needs to retreat to recover. Not because something went wrong in the moment, but because staying open for too long feels unsustainable. So the withdrawal follows. This is why they're often misread as cold or arrogant. People assume the distance is intentional, a message being sent, a judgment being made. In reality, it's regulation, not rejection. Their warmth wasn't an act, and their silence isn't punishment. It's the natural rhythm of a system that oscillates between engagement and protection, between connection and containment. Without that retreat, the internal overload becomes unmanageable. What looks like inconsistency is actually self-preservation. They aren't pulling away because they don't care. They pull away because caring deeply requires more energy than their system can sustain continuously. And without understanding that rhythm, others only see the mask, not the cost of wearing it. What keeps you safe at first doesn't always keep you free. Silence begins as protection, a way to avoid emotional harm, misunderstanding, and unnecessary conflict. But when it becomes the default response, something subtle shifts. The strategy that once preserved you starts to narrow your life. At first, the costs are easy to ignore. You feel regulated, stable, in control. There are fewer emotional explosions, fewer explanations that go nowhere. Quiet feels clean, manageable, but slowly, the consequences accumulate. Connection thins. Conversations stay surface level. People interact with a version of you that never fully arrives. 9. Teen saying, teen sixth, and over time, a strange loneliness settles in, not because you're alone, but because no one truly knows you. This is the paradox of emotional withdrawal. The walls that keep pain out also keep intimacy out. Needs go unspoken. Boundaries stay implicit. Resentment has nowhere to move, so it turns inward. You begin to carry entire emotional experiences by yourself, not because you prefer independence, but because asking feels impossible. And perhaps the hardest part is this: the longer silence lasts, the harder it becomes to break. Expression starts to feel foreign. Vulnerability feels risky. Even when safe people appear, your system doesn't automatically recognize safety. It recognizes habit. What once protected you now confines you. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. The prison isn't built from isolation alone. It's built from adaptation that was never meant to be permanent. And without awareness, survival strategies can outlive the danger they were designed to respond to, leaving you protected, but increasingly alone, inside the very walls that once kept you intact. Healing doesn't begin by forcing yourself to speak. For someone who learned to survive through silence, the goal isn't to become louder, more expressive, or emotionally exposed overnight. That kind of pressure only recreates the very conditions that made silence necessary in the first place. Silence isn't the problem. Unsafety is. What needs to change isn't your temperament, it's the environment around your expression. When silence formed, it did so because words weren't met with care. So healing begins not by abandoning quiet, but by redefining when and where it's no longer required. Safety, in this context, is specific. It's being listened to without correction. It's curiosity instead of defensiveness. It's space to speak without being rushed, minimized, or reinterpreted. And safety doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small moments, a response that doesn't escalate, a question asked without agenda, a pause that holds instead of interrupts. Over time, the nervous system starts to update its expectations. Expression no longer equals threat. Being seen doesn't automatically lead to harm. This is where silence shifts, not from shutdown to exposure, but from reflex to choice. You begin to notice when you're quiet because you want to be, and when you're quiet because you're afraid. And that awareness alone creates space. Not pressure to perform vulnerability, but permission to test connection gradually, on your own terms. Silence doesn't need to disappear to make room for healing. It just needs somewhere safe to soften, because when safety is present, words tend to return on their own. Not forced, not rehearsed, but finally free to land where they belong. If you recognized yourself somewhere in the silence, the withdrawal, the careful holding back, there's something important you deserve to hear. You're not broken. You didn't miss a step everyone else learned. You adapted. What looks like distance today is often the residue of intelligence under pressure. A system that learned how to survive when connection didn't feel safe. And survival, even when it costs us something later, is never a personal failure. This isn't an invitation to suddenly speak more. It's an invitation to feel less alone in the quiet. Connection doesn't begin with explaining everything you've ever felt. It begins when your experience is understood without being argued with. When silence is respected, not interrogated. When presence doesn't demand performance, and those spaces exist even if you haven't found them yet. This channel was created for conversations like this. For the quiet patterns people rarely talk about, and the inner experiences that don't always have language. If this video helped you feel seen, even just a little, I invite you to stay. Consider subscribing if you want more reflections on the psychology behind silence, self-protection, and emotional healing. We explore the parts of the human mind that don't shout but still matter deeply. And if any part of this resonated with you, I'd really like to hear from you. You don't have to explain everything. A sentence is enough. Share your experience in the comments, not to be fixed, not to be judged, but to be witnessed, because connection doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes, it begins with knowing you're not the only one who learned to be quiet to survive.